1. I used to work as a receptionist in a small senior living facility for the elderly, most with dementia and some without. At the time, there was only 22 residents living at the facility. The company I worked for took over the building about 1 or 2 years prior. Before this, it was still a senior living facility run by a different company, which had been there since at least the 1980s. There were so many paranormal ghost stories shared among the employees, some who had worked there under the old company, but I'll share my own experience. This happened near the small quiet room TV room. Under the old company, this was a residence room, but the company I worked for converted it into a communal area. The quiet room has a few folding chairs in the corners, and we leave the door open at all times so that anyone can come in to use it. At the time, the TV room was hardly used by residents or staff members because there is a larger TV room in which everyone liked to gather, so it is very unusual to see someone sitting in there unless it was a resident who had outside visitors. The square room has a door directly in the middle of the wall, and the chair positioned just to the right of the door is positioned in a way where, when walking past the room, you can see the front legs and front edges of the chair seat, but not the backrest or the back legs. This happened around the late afternoon between 3 to 4 p.m., during the lull between afternoon snack time and dinner time when residents are relaxing. I wanted to check on a resident who lived down the hall, just next to the quiet room. I headed straight there, didn't bother looking in the quiet room. I presumed it was empty because there's no noise coming from the room, and checked on the resident without problem. Afterwards, I had to go back to my desk for a non-emergency but still important reason, and had to quickly walk back. On the way, I naturally glanced through the quiet room's doors without stopping, just to make sure. You have to be on alert since residents can walk into a room quietly and have a fall without anyone around, and in case of dementia patients, try to sneak out the quiet room side door and wander off. I didn't slow my pace as I saw the bottom half of a person sitting in the chair, tucked into that quiet room corner. Walking down the hall from that angle, I couldn't see the torso or face of the person, so I took note of the stature and clothing, very petite, 4'10"-ish, very thin and somewhat frail. Most likely a woman. The shoes were very typical black leather Oxford style, dark socks, and grey-black straight-leg pants. I did not see a walker nearby. I couldn't pop my head in, I needed to get back to my station quickly, and besides, they didn't seem to need immediate help. I'll check on them right after this task, I thought. Due to the stature of this person, it had to be only one of 2 women, who were the only people of the same build. Mrs. K, who was a tiny Asian woman with dementia who typically just frequents the dining room for some ice cream, but sometimes walks along the hallways near her room. Note, the quiet room is not near her room, but it is near the dining room. She uses a walker. If the person I saw was her, then it was concerning that she'd explore the hallways without her walker. Mrs. H, a tiny non-dementia white woman who wasn't a resident, but her husband was. She frequently visited every other day, or slept over on the weekends. It was a Sunday, her usual day to visit or sleep over. She would sometimes use the quiet room to read. She does not use a walker, and is very independent in everything she does. Since I wasn't able to check on them right away, I thought that I should phone a caregiver there to check on them, especially if it was Mrs. K. However, when I was walking back to my station, I had to walk past the dining room and saw Mrs. K eating her ice cream with her walker beside her. Okay, so the person sitting there was definitely Mrs. H, I thought. I went back to my desk and did whatever I needed to do without feeling rushed to check on the quiet room. I hadn't seen Mrs. H all day, but it could have been possible that she walked down the main hall, the hall my desk monitors, during the frequent times I stepped away from my desk. Mrs. H was most likely reading in the quiet room, and she was physically able to walk around the facility without assistance. She also didn't enjoy anyone coddling her or interrupting her reading time. There was really no need for anyone to check on Mrs. H right away. The rest of the evening went normally. I was watching out for S, Mr. and Mrs. H's daughter, who picks up Mrs. H when it's time for her to go home. But she never arrived. This meant that Mrs. H was going to spend the night. Around 5 p.m., which is when dinner starts and when I clock out for the day, I checked the quiet room to check on Mrs. H, but I found it empty. I didn't give any thought to it. It wasn't unusual since she might have walked into the dining room already. I clock out normally and go home. The next day, I clock in at 9 a.m. and the Monday morning goes fine. About 10 a.m. I see none other than Mrs. H and S walk through the front door. I'm a bit surprised since I presumed Mrs. H had slept over. But this might have meant that either S had picked her up after I clocked out, or S came back early in the morning to take Mrs. H out and bring her back to the facility. I said something along the lines of Mrs. H being a frequent visitor, that she visited both yesterday and now today, only for both S and Mrs. H replying that they had not visited yesterday at all. That weekend they had visited on Saturday. I don't work Saturdays, so I wasn't aware. This led to a slightly awkward recovery on my end, saying that I must have gotten Mrs. H mixed up with another visitor. They brushed it off politely, citing that we must get a lot of visitors. We don't. It is a mystery on who I saw that Sunday afternoon. It is most likely a resident long past who used to live in that room before it was remodeled, when the facility operated under the old company. I asked one of the med aides who had worked under the old company if she had any ideas as to who this person was, and she had some speculations. However, the facility had been operating for many decades as a nursing home, so it could have been many different people who lived there at some point over the years. While I'm disappointed I never saw their face, I think it would have been more unsettling if I had. After this encounter I was left creeped out but not utterly surprised. My co-workers had told me dozens of ghost stories about the facility. Now I'm able to tell one of my very own. 2. I have had an interest in the paranormal ever since I was a kid, and I discovered my first book of true ghost stories. A few years ago I gave up being part of a paranormal research team that I had been a member of for 5 years, because 1. I was turning into a massive cynic about the whole thing. Not only the field of research, but also the people in general that are involved. And 2, I started to find it boring. I actually wasn't enjoying it anymore. Reading the stories here, I have started remembering why the subject of the paranormal interested me in the first place. So here is the first thing that happened to me that I couldn't explain. It doesn't sound massively terrifying, but at the time, it certainly scared me and left a lasting impression that is with me still. It happened around the early 1980s at an ordinary suburban schoolyard in the Midlands, UK, when I was around the age of 9. I loved reading and would always have a book on the go. Very often, if I was into a particularly good book, I would take myself off to a quiet part of the school playing field to read at lunch break. This day I had taken myself about halfway up the school field to sit next to the long jump pit. Just behind the long jump pit was a chain-link fence, behind which was gardens belonging to a row of 1940s semi-detached houses. Sitting where I was, I had a very good view right into the gardens, and into the rear windows of the houses themselves. I was soon lost in the book when something stirred me. It was a sound that at first hearing barely managed a second thought, but after I heard it again, I put down my book and listened. A distinct breath. It sounded like a long gasp of air, rasping and bubbling. I was puzzled at first. Didn't know what to make of it. I began to think that I had imagined it or misheard something else, but then I was surprised to hear it again. I began to feel a little unnerved. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the fence. Curious but slightly nervous, I put down my book, got up, and walked towards the fence to investigate. I looked around the area where the breath seemed to come from. Just grass on both sides of the fence. No bushes or shrubs either side where anything could hide. I was about to dismiss the sound and walk away when it happened again. This time it was much louder and seemed to be coming from right in front of me, just the other side of the fence. I was suddenly scared, I have no idea why. I can remember the wave of fear that went from my head to my toes, and it really did feel like the hair on the back of my neck prickled. I bolted, ran as fast as I could away from the fence. I found one of the dinner ladies and babbled out the story of what I had heard. She took my hand and marched me back to the area of the fence where I had heard the breath. She had a good look around the area, and finding nothing, she declared that it was probably an animal or something that had scared me. I secretly wondered how it could be an animal when there was nowhere for it to hide. We had just turned our backs to walk away when I heard the breath again, loud and clear and horrible from right next to us. "There you go, did you hear that?" I shouted. She told me she had heard nothing. I couldn't believe it. How could she not have heard it? It came from right next to us and was loud enough that there was no way she couldn't have heard it. She obviously put it down to an overactive imagination of a child, and said that maybe if the area bothered me so much, I shouldn't sit there, and walked off. I knew what I had heard, and after she had gone, was not going to hang around there for much longer. I picked up my discarded book and legged it back to the school. All the remaining time I attended that school, I avoided the area next to the long jump pit as much as I possibly could. The thing is, that sound has stayed with me for almost 35 years. I can remember the sound and the way I felt clearly. A year or so ago, I was checking out the local history of where I had grown up. I came across an account of murders that had happened in the town. One in particular was really interesting. In the 1700s, apparently two chaps got into a bit of a quarrel, and one of them smacked the other one over the head several times with a large bit of wood and left him to die of his head injuries. The best bit, the area where this happened had the same name as my school. I can't say for sure that the school was exactly where this happened, and I have been unable to find out any info on why the school had that particular name. It was built in the 1950s, and according to my father, that area was farmland before. But this bit of information seemed interesting enough for me to add as a footnote here. 3. To date, what happened to me yesterday, 18th of November 2018, was the strangest and most peculiar thing I have witnessed, and really I don't know what to make of it. I live in a very small town of 1,000 in southwest Michigan. I'm not from here, but moved out a couple of years ago from a bigger town about an hour away. I was out with some friends, catching up with some dinner at Applebee's, and at about 10 we all departed and went our separate ways. It was about an hour and a half drive back to my face, and I'm used to driving it and driving it dark and all that because of my job. Anyways, to get to what I saw, I rolled into my town at about 11:30, and the town is dead quiet at this point like it usually is. Now there's one major crossroad in town that, if you're coming into town, has a small restaurant and gas station on the left, and parallel is a library and second gas station. I was just coming up to the crossroads, and I'm not gonna lie, I was looking at my phone changing a song when, out of the corner of my eye, I see something move out of the street by the restaurant. I slam on my brakes, and what I believe I saw was a man on stilts. Except these were some exceptional stilts, because if I had to guess, he was about 15 feet tall. He took one stride and looked at me. This is where it gets even stranger to me. He was wearing a black and white checkered tailored suit jacket with grey dress pants, aviator sunglasses, and a top hat. Now, I've seen people on stilts before, and their arms are always normal size, but this guy's arms were just about down to his knees like a proportional being. He then took 2 more strides and was out of sight behind the library. I then pulled up and grabbed my phone to get a picture of this guy, but he was gone. I turned down the street to try and find him, but looking down the alleyways and local streets, I couldn't find him. I am absolutely baffled by this incident. I want to believe that it was just some dude pulling off a rather impressive cosplay, but something seems so off about it. The entire encounter was maybe 4 or 5 seconds long, but I remember it so vividly. I haven't told anyone about this, and really posting here is my best chance to possibly get an understanding, or maybe someone else who has seen anything similar. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. 4. My grandmother, who I'll call Jessica for this, died when she was 41. She had long issues with alcoholism and was a functioning alcoholic most of her adult life. But despite this awful disease, she was the mother of 4 kids and a loving wife to my grandfather Tom. One morning, Jessica woke up feeling ill with a headache, and by noon that same day she had passed from a brain hemorrhage. It was a massive shock to the family. All of the kids were still somewhat young, all between the ages of 14 to 22, so it was especially heartbreaking for them. Tom never remarried or dated, and doesn't talk about her much, which we can't blame him for. But the rest of the family loved telling stories about her eccentric personality and joy for life. My mother, aunt, and 2 uncles always tell stories about her at parties or general family gatherings, so all the cousins and myself know about Jessica. However, this is about something else. My family aren't religious, but a few of us are spiritual. My cousin Maria is especially spiritual, and she is 100% sure Jessica never left Tom's house. As I said before, I'm skeptic, but I just wanted to write out some of the experiences we've had with Jessica. The one that most affected me was when both my mother and myself experienced something in Tom's house. We were staying over, and one night around midnight, my mother came out of her room and started calling out, "What? What?" I asked her what she was doing, and she was positive someone called out her name. Not Mum, but her actual name. And I was like, "You're tired. Go to bed." I didn't hear anything, so didn't believe her. Just the next day, I was being the nosy thing I am, and looking through Tom's book collections in his spare room. My mom had just returned back from work, and she was downstairs with Tom. I had heard a familiar female voice call out my name while I was in one of the wardrobes. It was loud enough to be in the room with me. I turned around, no one there. I ran downstairs and asked what's up, assuming my mom called me, as she was the only woman in the house. She didn't. I started laughing about the weirdness of it, but it spooked me. It sounded like someone was standing 5 feet away from me. After those 2 days, we never heard the voice again. My mom was genuinely convinced it was Jessica, but we didn't want to ask Tom because we thought it'd seem insensitive. Maria has had many experiences with Jessica, or at least that's what she said. The story she tells the most is this. Maria had just gotten out of a long-term relationship with a not very nice guy. She was down in the dumps a bit, so when our other cousin Sarah came home from Spain with her new baby, she was keeping busy. Maria decided to take Sarah to clean up Jessica's gravestone, something everyone in the family takes turns doing, and leave some new flowers. Maria would always chat to the gravestone. Mostly funny little things, but she decided to ask Jessica to send her a new boyfriend, to which Sarah and Maria had a good laugh about. Not a week later, Maria met her now fiancé, soon husband, at a bar called Heaven. I always laugh about the name of the bar, but that's too good to be true. But Maria has been with her fiancé 6 years now, and has never been happier. The last one I'll tell is also about Maria, but is much spookier than the others. When she was a toddler, she was a very chatty little thing, talking to strangers, anyone who'd respond to her. It was very cute. Tom and my mum were looking after her one time in particular, and were having lunch at Tom's house when Maria went over to the armchair in the corner of the room. She settled in, turned to face the wall next to the armchair, and began talking to the wall. My mum thought it was funny at first until she noticed Maria was answering questions. Something like, "Yeah, okay. I'm in nursery. It's nice. I paint a lot. No, I don't do that." You get the picture. It freaked my mum out so badly she took her out of the house to play at a neighbor's house and asked Tom to check the house. No one was in there except the 3 of them at the time. My mum rarely took Maria to Tom's house after that. 5. As a child, I used to see things and learn to ignore it, not talk about it or tell anyone, but over time I developed other senses. Every now and then I will have a heavy feeling, almost as if a veil is covering me, and at that moment a thought will form in my head. I can tell when a person is lying or look at 2 people and sense a connection, almost as if I walked in on something intimate, personal, something I shouldn't know. A few years ago, I would have images of being in a car accident. I ignored it, and a few weeks later I would be in an accident. Now if I have a dream or have an image, thought of any kind, I avoid driving for months. About 2 years ago, my body started to hurt with no explanation. My back and legs were in immense pain. I felt as if I could not move. Afterward, I had an image of me in a hospital. I assumed it was another cancer scare. I had a few and promised myself if I get another I will check myself in a cancer research center. Later that week I went on with my day and was hit by a car. My most recent occurrence was when I moved back home with my 2 dogs, a pit mixed and a Yorkie. As I was walking them, an image flashed in my mind of me walking only with my pit. Months later, my neighbor's stupidity resulted in my Yorkie becoming so ill I had no choice but to put him down. My relationship with the paranormal extends a bit further than the randomness of thought, dreams, and images. I have an unusual understanding of witchcraft, rituals, and rites. My family seems to think I inherited my grandmother's spiritual connection to what we all assume to be Santeria. I was raised Catholic, went through the baptisms, confirmations, and communion, but it did not feel as genuine as the old religion. It's what I call anything relating to witchcraft, paganism, or any form of the old world craft. Sometimes I will get a call or a text about strange items left or found in houses or personal spaces. My sister and stepmother made this mistake, which I believe led to our family being torn apart. On that day I got a call from my sister, which I happily ignored, followed by several text messages. I finally called back and was told that while both were leaving the house, there was a small handkerchief-wrapped package on the steps of the front door. So they brought the small package in the house and unwrapped it. It was a small statue figure with other items, and at the bottom of the figure was a cork. So they did what any other naive person would do, remove the cork. According to my sister, it smelled and a strange sand-like substance fell out of the bottom. I had absolutely no words for this fuck-up. I lived 2 hours away, so I made my trip over thinking, why the hell would they bring it in the house? What the hell were they thinking? As soon as I got to the house, it felt as if there was a strange pressure. I asked my sister if they still had it, and why the fuck would you bring it in the house? She said no, and why wouldn't I? I could not believe the stupid reply. We walked back to the garbage cans where it was placed. The moment I looked at it, I realized it was a figure I once owned. A figure that matched a tattoo of an ex-boyfriend, a Grim Reaper. I kept it in an old box in the basement. Wrapped around it looked like a dainty rope or gold chain, a few charms, beads, something that seemed like a feather. She asked me to take it out so we can look at it. I refused to touch it. And I slammed the lid closed and told her and my stepmother, "You brought something in the house." They both said yeah, as if it was no big deal. I asked was anyone visiting the house as I went down to the basement, heading straight for my old box. They were looking at me as if I was insane. I opened the box, searched for the figure, and it was indeed gone. I explained to them that the statue was mine, left in this box. How did you find it outside? Was someone down here? As they both tried to convince me I never owned it, I must have dreamt of it, my frustration overwhelmed me. You brought something into this house that is not a goddamn gift from God, and now you both are screwing with me. In the next couple of months, you will both be at fault for anything that happens, unless you get a spiritual cleansing. Neither did a cleansing, or even brought holy water. So in the next couple of months, both my sister and stepmother lost their jobs. My father's job became highly demanding and stressful. By the year's end, something wasn't right. As it turns out, my father and stepmother separated but are unable to sell their shared house. My sister on occasion blames me for being a witch for the bad luck. It amazes me how after all these years they still do not understand. My advice to anyone who comes across anything in their personal space that seems to be odd or unfamiliar is, do not touch it. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 112. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use and sent in stories for use in this video. I'm gonna keep this short as we are heading into the weekend and I'm feeling a bit tired. So I'm gonna head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.